When I started making electronic music about 10 years ago, I got this plugin called Black Hole. Not sponsored. And I could send just about anything through it and it sounded awesome. So therefore, I started to send everything through it. And this was really great when I was just improvising with a single synth or something. It sounded really, really good. But then when I started multi-tracking and actually trying to layer different synth parts on top of each other, all of them with their own instance of Black Hole, it kind of got muddy and just became a big jumbled mess. And maybe this is something that you've experienced. Because I would listen to my favorite ambient artist and all of their mixes seemed to have a certain amount of clarity and separation, like there was a spot and a place for each element. And I had no idea how they were doing that as I continued to turn up the mix knob on Black Hole. Today we'll look at some ways that we can achieve that sort of clarity and separation that I really like even in ambient mixes without giving up our wishy-washy reverbs that we all love so much. Broadly speaking, there are really only two ways to think about reverb in our productions, in our mixes. The first would be to think of it as the room we're in, or as the space. It's kind of simulating a physical space. And the second would be to use it more creatively as a creative effect. Now, to illustrate the first case, and because I haven't used a pipe organ analogy in quite some time, and it is my primary instrument, the organ is a great example of an instrument that sits in a physical space that is designed to round out the kind of hard edges of the organ. It's a common saying among organists that the best stop on the organ is the room that it's in. Because the organ itself, if you've ever listened to one up close or in a particularly dry space, is kind of harsh and unforgiving and not the most musical sound in the world. There's no subtlety in terms of velocity expression, there's no subtlety in terms of any sort of forgiveness in the attack or decay or release of the tone. It just kind of starts and stops. In short, it's a really difficult instrument to make sound good. I remember when I was a student, I used to practice in a very small room that had a pipe organ in it. It was a practice room. It was designed for the purpose of allowing you to hear all of the mistakes that you might just gloss over if you were in a big cathedral or a big concert hall. And I can confirm it did sound very bad. But if you could play something and it sounded pretty clean and halfway decent in there, you knew it was going to translate really well to the cathedral. The room's natural reverb rounds off the harsh edges and kind of blends all of the different colors of the organ together in a way that makes it feel more unified. And a really important concept that applies to our mixes, we as organists have to adjust our playing depending on the size of the room that we're playing in. So if it's a particularly wet space, gotta stop using that word since I can't say it. If it's an especially wet space, then we might have to play slower and more deliberately, and maybe even with a little bit more detachment, less legato. Simply for the fact that it's gonna sound like absolute mud if we go too fast and play everything connected. Just like our mixes do if we just slam up the reverb mix and have a lot of busy arpeggios or busy scales and things like that going on. So it actually impacts our compositional process as well. We can kind of think about how we're going to use the reverb while we're writing the piece. That's a very helpful thing to do. This is exactly why your slow synth pad or drone works really, really well in a drenched reverb environment, but your really quick passages or arpeggios or things that have a lot of chord changes don't. If we think about reverb in this way as being an emulation of a physical space, we probably only want one space, and then we can bring multiple instruments into that one space. And in the production and mixing stage, we can achieve this by putting our reverb, one instance of a reverb, on a send, and then sending all of the individual elements through it. That was transformational for my mixes because I was literally putting a reverb instance, Black Hole, it was my favorite, on every single track, and it sounded terrible. It causes so much frequency overlap, so many phase issues that just the sounds start to cancel each other out and everything sounds washed together. And your CPU might want to die if it's as old as mine was. So if you haven't tried that, just give that a shot, and I can almost guarantee that it's going to immediately clean things up. Just one instance of a reverb, and then send your tracks, your individual elements, through that one reverb. But that doesn't mean that we should never place reverbs on our tracks individually. It's just a different application for reverb and achieves a different effect. This approach really uses reverb more like a sound design tool, where it's a part of the sound itself. But obviously we can still run into those same problems that I outlined earlier, things overlapping and getting muddy. So I like to do two things if I'm using reverb in this way, as an effect, to negate those issues. The first would be to limit the frequency range of each part, and the second would be to limit the stereo field of each part. I didn't really understand why I had so much trouble mixing my own tracks that were synth heavy and had tons of layers of synthesizers, all with their own reverbs, until I got hold of one of my friend BP Moore's tracks, which was incredibly guitar heavy. And as I was producing that track, I noticed how much easier it was to mix, because all of the guitars were mono, first of all, and even the effects of guitars are oftentimes in mono, even the reverbs. So you can pan a reverb and put it very tidily in a very specific place. And that sort of changed the way I thought about my own mixing as well. Modern synths are usually stereo output. They are also capable of filling the entire frequency spectrum if you want them to. It's up to you to shave the sounds down if it's a subtractive synth. And then we usually compound these issues by sending that stereo, incredibly broad frequency spectrum signal through a massive stereo reverb that's very difficult to control in a multi-level mix. But in working with Ben's guitar layers, I noticed how much easier that was, because even things like the amps and the distortions of guitars often narrow the frequency spectrum, so they're almost bandpassed and often mono, like we talked about. So they were incredibly easy, even though there were tons of layers of guitars, to just put one over here, put one over here, put one right here, put one coming down the middle, one over here, each of them having their own depth because they had their own mono reverb baked in. And nothing will ever sound wider than two mono elements that are hard panned left and right. It's just the widest thing you will ever get. And that's really how a lot of mixes achieve the amount of clarity that often leave us wondering how they did it. So I started to apply these concepts that I learned from mixing guitars into my synth-heavy tracks as well, and it really helped clean things up. So hopefully that's something that you can take into consideration and use as well. As I briefly touched on earlier in the video, we can drastically help our mixes and productions by learning a bit more about the arrangement process in the compositional part of the process. There are a lot of things that we can think about in that initial compositional process that will help make our lives easier when we get to the mix or get to the production stage. If you'd like to learn more about some of my personal favorite compositional concepts, I've compiled an ebook for you that's absolutely free and is down in the description below. It'll be the first link there if you're interested.